councillors, to staff, to the public gallery and to our friends in the media. It's obviously been a significant day in the city in terms of external investment in economic development projects of which this council has a keen interest, more than $50 million from the Provincial Growth Fund, including nearabouts to $20 million for each of for stage one of the waterfront redevelopment project, $20 million into Hillside Workshop and $10 million for the Centre of Digital Excellence, trading as code. A huge amount of effort has gone into those projects, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to go on record for thanking in particular Nicola Pinfold and Fraser Liggett for the extreme amount of work that they have done. Going above and beyond as proud civil servants and losing years of their lives in the process, but it was all worth it today as the government checkbook opened just before the heavens did. There's no public forum for the meeting, but in order to be able to be fully met, we need to swear in all members. And so I would like to invite Andrew Wiley to come forward and profess his declaration.
I, Andrew Peter Wiley, declare that I will faithfully, impartially and according to the best of my skill and judgment execute and perform in the best interests of the City of Dunedin the powers, authorities and duties vested in or imposed upon me as a member of the Dunedin City Council by virtue of the Local Government Act 2002, the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act 1987 or any other act.
There are no apologies. Item 3, confirmation of the agenda.
Your worship.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
In terms of the agenda and the introductory comments you made, I'm wondering if it might not be appropriate if we agreed to include a resolution that the Chief Executive could draft noting today's announcements and conveying our appreciation to government for that largesse.
I think that will be most appropriate. Thank you for the suggestion. I'll move that Council confirm the agenda with the following addition and alteration in regard to Standing Order 2.1 Option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments, and that item 3.1 declaration by members be included in the agenda. Well, there we go. Seconded Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Aye. Those against? That's agreed. Item 3.1 has been dealt with. Item 4, declarations of interest. I'll move that the Council notes the elected members' interest register attached as attachment A, confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interests and notes the executive leadership team's interest register as attached as attachment B. Seconded Councillor Elder. All those in favour? Aye. Those against? That's agreed. Item 5, appointment to the Otago Museum Trust Board, Ms Graham and Ms Bodecker. Just Ms Graham. I'd like to speak to it. Any questions of the report? Councillor Lord. Thank you. Councillor Gary? Any speakers? Would you like to speak to it, Councillor Lord? I just want to mention briefly, speak briefly to Part A, acknowledging the contribution made by Kate Wilson to the Otago Museum Trust Board. While the Otago Museum isn't something that is directly operated by this council, it is something that we substantially fund. We are its most significant funder, and so it's in our best interests for it to be well governed and well managed, not just for that reason, but for the fact that it is a significant educational and community asset for not just Dunedin but the wider Otago region, and it has had a difficult past in terms of governance and management, and Councillor Wilson, along with Councillor Staines and the late Graham Crombie, played a not insignificant part in helping shift that organisation and turn it around to be the high performing entity that it currently is. And so I think it's appropriate for us to acknowledge the work of the former Councillor Wilson in being our appointment, and I welcome Councillor van der Vis to the work. Thank you for saying yes. Any further speakers? Your right of reply, sir. I'll put it. All those in favour? Aye. Those against? That's agreed. Item 6, DCC submission on the Otago Regional Council proposed plan change 6AA. Mr. Drew, Mr. Dyer. I'd like to speak to it in the first instance.
Yes, please, briefly. So prior to the meeting, after a few of the councillors considering this paper, there's a bit of commentary around our submissions, kind of silence on the how long the dates have been shifted out in terms of the implementation or the implementation of the discharge contaminant and nitrogen leaching components of Plan Change 6A from 2014. So we've got a proposal for an amendment to the submission, which I'd suggest we put up earlier. So this is that we're talking about adding these two paragraphs between paragraph 3 and 4 of the submission, which is page 25 of the agenda. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Give people a moment to digest the staff's suggestion. Happy to take questions on it if there are any. Councillor Gary.
I just wanted to ask about paragraph 13, which talks about the legal advice. Earlier it refers to the attachment C, which is iwi and others who talk about, and Doc I think it was, who talk about not being happy with the extension out to 2026. And it appears that the legal advice had changed all of that. Do you have a comment on that at all?
Broadly, our understanding is that the more recent legal advice is suggesting that the consent conditions or the conditions and the plan rules that are in the existing plan are legally and practically and are legally unworkable and not necessarily practical conditions to apply. So that's the basis for the whole plan change.
Yeah. So it was more about, in 13, it says, however, the ORC in response to legal advice extended the commencement date, even though in the feedback the request was to make it earlier. That's really what I'm referring to.
So my understanding of the date was the ORC needed the time to do a full and comprehensive, robust review, and they didn't think the initial 3-year time frame was sufficient, and that was the driver for extending it to 2026.
Councillor Hulan.
I had similar concerns to Councillor Geary when I read that too, I have to say, because it did sound like there was concerns with iwi particularly around those dates. But my question is pertaining to ORC have stated a few times in that report that, one of the issues could be that if they were 2020 or even 2023, that a lot of people would rush to put consents in. What is to stop people from putting consents in if it went to 2026 and doing the same thing? Because that would then just extend it out again.
hard to say. There is probably nothing to stop that.
That's what I thought.
However, it's a matter for the IOC to, and obviously they're managing it through this mechanism at the moment.
Do you have, can I just ask, do you have any concerns about water quality, given that they're trying to extend it out another 6 years to what was proposed, about how that will affect the water quality, and what sort of concerns would you have there?
Obviously, the plan and the plan change 6A was around improving a bunch of water quality parameters for Otago, and that not being carried out sooner rather than later is not necessarily a good thing for the receiving environment. However, what the IOC are saying in their proposal is that they don't believe that even applying those rules as they stand would have any benefit for the environment, and that's thus delaying things for a period while they change things to make those rules more workable and provide that benefit.
The report also states that some of those consents are quite minor, and that's one of the reasons they said that those people might go for consents, but they said it's a bit of a waste of inferring that it might be a waste of money because they're minor. But one might question why they couldn't fix those consents if they're minor before the date of 2020.
I think in this case it's more about fixing the rules in the plan to enable those consents and enable those consents to be workable and for those consents to provide value for both the consent holder and the receiving environment. And what they're saying is that plan change is not something that they can do quickly.
Thank you.
Councillor Elder.
My understanding of the 6AA is that it's allowing time for them to actually update with the new freshwater standards so that you're not putting in something now and then changing it, you know, like in a year's time, which means people have to go for consents again. But also current issues with the water plan. And I was just wondering if you could sort of explain that a little bit to me about the nitrogen, etc., and testing that.
Yes, 6AA is predominantly, well, it is about, so I'm just reading from ORC's document here. It's conditions controlling discharge, contaminant concentration, and on nitrogen leaching coming to force. So some of the reasons that they say the existing rules are uncertain, unenforceable and ambiguous around things like one of the rules does not specify a time scale when nitrogen leaching rates should be calculated. So it's all about mass load of nitrogen, which requires a time period. Another thing that they reference is there are practical difficulties in locating where diffuse discharges should be sampled to check compliance. So a lot of these things are around the practicalities, how you actually monitor and enforce the rule. There's also a reference to some software that's no longer current. So they're saying you must use a piece of software for nitrogen leaching rates, but that software is no longer available. So there are a number of practical elements that mean that it's difficult for them to enforce the rules or make them uncertain and ambiguous.
Thank you.
Does that clarify?
Yeah, that explains it.
Further questions? Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Mr Dwyer, I note on page 38 where we have a list of all the different discharge catchments. Tomahawk is not located on that list. Tomahawk Lagoon. Can you give me an understanding why?
couldn't find an answer for that particular question, and I'd be happy to take that one on notice and work through it with the regional council.
Thank you. So just getting clarification from my mind is that this is all about discharge, whether it's grey water or storm water, and there's discharge of our waters into the system, whether it's the sea, the rivers, creeks, whatever it may be, correct?
So this plan change particularly applies to a rural landscape and discharge to fresh water. But yes, it broadly is correct.
So I'm just, as I read through this and then looked at item 7 coming up, essentially everything we do with water goes through ORC. There's nothing that we do with water, except for, I guess, even drinking water we control or go through that process, but all other discharge water actually ends up going through ORC. Or is there anything that we retain authority on?
No, for all of our discharges to the environment, be it freshwater or to the marine environment, we hold consents with the ORC.
Then, so I just want to go back. No, actually, that's fine. Thank you.
Further questions? Would someone like to move Councillor Gary with the suggested amendment? Is there a second? Seconded Councillor Staines. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor Gary? Any discussion? Being none, I'll put it. All those in favour? Aye. Those against? You're voting for, Councillor Hurley? No? Okay, thank you. Would you like your vote recorded against? Okay. That's agreed. Item 7, DCC submission on essential freshwater action for healthy waterways. Welcome back, Mr. Dyer and Mr. Drew. Would you like to speak to this?
No, happy to take this paper as read.
Thank you. Questions, councillors? Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Thank you, Worship. Mr. Dwyer, I sent through some questions earlier, and one of them was relating to the Freshwater Leaders Group that actually seemed to have quite an influence on the submission or the document that was presented by government in early September. And just going, as I read through that, I looked at, of that document, paragraph 44 was drinking water sources must be protected. So in looking at that, the one question I have is, are all the DCC's areas of drinking water sources protected?
I'll give a long-winded answer. So we have quite a few different drinking water sources that have differing levels of protection, so ranging from deep creek and deep stream catchments, of which we own a third, own and manage and control all of the activity that happen in a third of that catchment. The other 2/3 is owned and managed by DOC, that is, in a national context, quite a high level of control and therefore quite a high level of security. Remote environment, very limited activity occurring in it that could potentially contaminate that water supply. The Silver Stream catchment is another one of our major water sources. It's in a similar state in that it's owned by Dunedin City Council and managed and kept predominantly in native bush, and therefore provides quite a high quality drinking water source. We do have another couple of sources that are less actively managed, so the drinking water source for Waikawaiti and the drinking water source for the West Tairi Rural Water Scheme. Both are sourced from reasonably significant rivers with a number of differing activities that occur upstream, but those risks are managed through water safety planning and a whole bunch of other processes that we undertake to try and make sure that any potential contamination doesn't affect the end user, being our ratepayers who drink the water. So largely, Dunedin City Council is in a good position in terms of the security of our water sources and how they are managed.
I can testify to that. In a previous life, I've been involved in a number of New Zealand water schemes, and Dunedin City Council's urban water scheme, so the Deep Creek, Deep Stream, Silver Stream, and it's a surface water catchment, so it's one of the safest I've seen.
Yep, thank you. Then the other thing that I noted as I'm looking at the submission and reading reference documents, the government has a 3 waters review underway. Can you update me or give me an idea of where that's at? Because I sort of see this all tying together.
There are a lot of reviews relating to the 3 waters activities that are current at the moment. We are in a position now where we've got a confirmation of a drinking water regulator, and we're expecting a bill to be passed shortly. That drinking water regulator could potentially cover a number of other activities. We're also expecting another cabinet paper looking at service delivery options for 3 waters across the country in the next month or 2 as well. All of those papers are sort of in train at the moment, and that they have another paper to come afterwards to confirm further details. But broadly, we're looking at the potential for new drinking water standards, a new drinking water regulator, and a regulator that will potentially cover a bunch of other areas. And then to tie into this particular paper, we're looking at the potential establishment of minimum bottom line standards for discharges for stormwater and wastewater.
Sorry, I just lost my place here in the... There we go. There was also reference to a freshwater commission. Freshwater commission. You know, it seems to me that there's a lot of things happening, and what we're trying to submit on is a piece of that. And then I heard earlier in previous questions, item 6, that a lot of this actually is all going through ORC anyway. So I'm trying to get my head around is actually, why is the relevance for us to be submitting on this?
Question around the Otago Regional Council is that the Regional Council are responsible for regulating the receiving environment. What goes into the receiving environment is frequently the domain of the City Council, which is our direct interest.
So, Your Worship, so I'm trying to get an understanding here, because the discharge of stormwater and grey water essentially is what a lot of this is relating to.
So it would be fair to say, a moving feast. There are a lot of moving parts in this, and we're being asked to submit on each individually. And that's not ideal from anybody's perspective. With regard to this one, and the next 2 actually, but this one in particular. So although we have to get consents from the ORC, the way the government sets up the rules around those consents then guides the ORC for the conditions they put on those consents, and that potentially has a massive financial implication on us, on our residents. So we've been the team have been pretty careful in all 3 of these submissions to take a position that says on an issue where the council doesn't, we're neutral. We just say that we're neutral. This one doesn't particularly have an impact on us one way or another. But where we think this will be bad for people who are interacting with us, more costly, more expensive, then we say we think this isn't being done the best way. Or where we think these are sensible changes that will actually streamline processes, then we say that. So in all of these cases, we take a why does the DCC care about this? And from our perspective, is there something that we get through many of these that we never comment on, many submissions government asks for that we don't comment on. Generally, we make decisions and the policy team go through everyone and make a call. Look, this is one that actually affects the way the DCC does its business, and that's why these ones are in here, because it affects how we deliver. Even though ORC does the consenting, the rules they set will be affected by this, and that will then have a flow-on impact on us. And so we want to lobby to get the rules that work for the city.
Thank you for that answer, because that actually leads into one of the key questions I had, is looking at this submission and looking at the documents. and already seeing some of the information come through the ODT, I'm really fearful what the cost of some of this is going to be to the council, and you just related to that, and to the ratepayers, and where central government is on funding this aspect. Is that a question anybody can ask? Is there any, we've just had Provincial Growth Fund money. Is there going to be a fund for Three Waters infrastructure?
So in the near term, one of the cabinet papers we're expecting to see, I alluded to it before around service delivery. It also includes, should include some commentary on funding and funding impacts for the Three Waters sector. It's something that that all of the proposals have raised as an important consideration, but nevertheless the proposals have been proceeding.
So have we articulated strong enough in this document about the cost implications on ratepayers and to our city as we've submitted? Because I think there's a lot of good discussion in this submission, but if we were going to follow through, and looking at some of the supporting documents that I've read prior to this meeting, the cost implications are quite dramatic.
I think the question of whether something is articulated strongly enough is a political one, and it's up to council to decide that. And if you think it is or isn't, you're welcome to make amendments to strengthen it or not. Any further questions?
Oh, actually, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's on that same issue as we work through the maze of the implications of statutory change of this kind. Can you assure us that the level of data we have, for example, about stormwater point discharges, is going to be adequate for us to consider the implications? And what I really want to know is, I'm assuming that if we were to ask for, someone were to ask for a map of what goes into the harbour where, and that's just an example, we would have information about the volumes involved in general and the quality of whatever it might be. Is that the case?
Yes, that is the case. We broadly know where we discharge, and where we have consents, we broadly know the quality of that discharge. What may come out of these proposals as the detail starts to fall out, and it's just high level at this stage, is that there is a higher threshold for that test around what is quality information and quality scientific information to base decision making on. That may change in time, but at the moment we do broadly understand those parameters.
And so that quality of the data, irrespective of the fact that it might change in the future, or the need might change in the future, is enough to give us more or less a rough order of cost on the implications of the envelope that we might be talking about various various changes in management of stormwater, for example.
I am sure that we could work through that envelope in time, but we haven't done that yet. We had this, submission has been with us for a period of about 6 or 7 weeks, I think, and that work in itself, in terms of looking at options and costings, is quite time intensive.
Thank you, Councillor Lord.
Yeah, actually, well, partly my question was partly answered by what the Chief said about the reasonableness or the unreasonableness of things, but I see in point 6D, it says the DCC supports in principle the measures proposed to protect and enhance the urban streams and wetlands and to provide for fish passage. However, the DCC requests the government ensure they do not unreasonably impact on the ability of territorial authorities to provide infrastructural services for communities. And I'm just also wondering, when I read in point 9, it says that it's expected that the implications for the farming sector will have a cost, but they say in there that the farming community themselves would be better to talk to that. But I'm just wondering, I've heard in a number of occasions here in previous meetings, and One of them was a meeting where Miss Mash spoke to us last year and talked about some of the consents that we had for one of the, I can't remember the Waitati or one of the northern discharge sewage schemes, how it had less breaches because the standards had changed, and what they'd actually done was lowered the standards so that we just didn't breach it as often. And she confirmed that by email after the meeting. And I'm just wondering, where do we see the balance between freshwater health and community water availability, swimming and beaches and that sort of thing? At what point do we make a decision that we can't afford to do something because of the cost? And I fully am aware that the cost could be billions if you're going to get every gutter and every point that runs to our creek or the harbour or whatever. It would be billions to tidy that up. But at what point do we make that decision that we can or can't do?
I'll take that question in two parts. So the first being around the, I think it was paragraph 6D. What we were alluding to there was this city has a huge volume of piped watercourses and piped stormwater infrastructure that could be seen to inhibit fish passage and wildlife passage. And broadly reading the proposals, if they were to go through as we read them, that would indicate a reasonably significant change would be required in how that infrastructure is provided. So that's what we were alluding to in that point. I think in terms of responding to your second question, I think that's broadly a political decision. At the moment, it's one that's being led by central government. We've developed a submission based on the things we know through Dunedin City Council's suite of strategies and all of that sort of thing, and done that from a perspective that is Dunedin City Council as a utility operator. If the council were looking to resolve something different in terms of that question, I'm not too sure what shape it would take, and we do have 1 day to be able to amend this submission and submit it through to central government. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's a hard thing for us to address.
Councillor Van der Vis.
Thank you. Regarding the 6A original discussions, battles in fact between the ORC. Oops. Thank you. Regarding the original 6A battles between the ORC and the DCC, which I think thankfully a lot of people here have been around long enough to have endured, extraordinarily expensive court battles where the ORC and the DCC had different interpretations of the rules. And there was the suggestion that of the, I think, 19 coastal discharge points that we had for stormwater, that what was being proposed was that we actually put a treatment station at the outfall of each one of these coastal discharge points. Is that kind of requirement, is that, do you think, going to resurface in 6AA, or have we put that to bed altogether? I mean, to put it simply, is it your view that the ORC still wants us to treat all our stormwater and individual discharge points before it goes into the coastal environment?
So the paper we're discussing, the freshwater submission, or our submission on the freshwater reform from central government, does propose minimum stormwater standards, minimum bottom line stormwater discharge standards. Now, depending on what those standards were, it doesn't have any figures around what the minimum standard for discharge might be, but depending on what those standards were, it is possible that we could end up in a position with having to treat that stormwater.
Okay, so we may or we may not, that might still come back. All right, the other question I had was for Mr. Drew. when he was talking about the security of drinking water being a catchment-based system and how that it compared favourably to many other schemes that you've got experience of around the country. My earlier advice was that we have a severe and vulnerable bottleneck in the supply of these drinking water, the main drinking water systems from Deep Creek, whatever, at Taiama Gorge, in that we have a old pipeline crossing a very deep gorge, and that if that were to fail for any reason, earthquake, whatever, that it would be many months before it would be possible to get a pipeline re-established there. When you were talking about the security of our drinking water, have you got a better understanding now of what alternatives are available? Do we have enough storage in the case of the failure of the Taiama Gorge pipeline? What is it that has changed from 10 years ago that now gives you confidence that we have real security in our water supply, drinking water supply?
For clarity, Councillor, the previous advice, is that from staff, you mean? You've been previously advised by staff that that is the case?
Yes.
Thank you.
Our staff and other people outside of staff.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Yeah,
thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so sorry, just to clarify, my statement before that was around water quality. So there's not things within the catchment that can impact on the quality of water that we take for drinking water. So you're referring to more a volume thing, is if there was a resilience, I guess there's a bottleneck, a resilience issue where the Deep Creek and the Deep Stream pipelines cross the Tairi, so that's a known resilience issue for us, and part of upgrading Ross Creek was to take that weak point out of the network, so if it did fail for any reason, we have a backup source being Ross Creek.
Is the backup source sufficient to cover the city, given that the vast majority of our water does come across Taiama Gorge?
So really broadly, we about 1/3 of our water supply comes across, one third of our potential water supply comes across that particular gorge through the Deep Creek and Deep Stream pipelines. We have another third, and that is for context, that is about 38,000 cubic metres per day. Now, the city's demand typically is 44,000 cubic metres a day. We then have another 30,000 cubic metre supply from the Tairi Infiltration Gallery at Outram. We have another 30,000 cubic metre supply from the Silver Stream, and we've implemented a number of projects to be able to make sure that we can move as much of that water from those other supplies to other areas. If we were in a situation where we had a really significant event that took out all of those supplies, we would be struggling, but really broadly, the only point in our network that we know would be a challenge that is obvious and would be a challenge to repair quickly is that gorge section. There are other sections where we could relatively quickly implement fixes through just our regular maintenance.
So as well as having a bit more flexibility in where our supplies come from, we also have now extra storage capacity as well, Mount Grand and various other places. So what you're saying is that the very vulnerable bottleneck that we had of 10 years ago is less so now. Even though it is vulnerable, we've got other options.
Yeah, correct. So under many scenarios, we're confident that we'd be able to ensure continuity of water supply to the city.
And just to finish off the Taiama Gorge bottleneck, do you have a lifespan for that old pipeline that comes across, and do we have a budget for doing anything about it?
It's not yet budgeted, but the beginnings of that budget will start to come into the end of the next LTP. So we are forecasting and have been forecasting through our infrastructure strategy. It's a document that forms part of the LTP to replace those pipelines in the period from 2032 for about 10 years.
So you're planning on replacing them in 10 years' time, is what you're saying, roughly?
Yeah, there or thereabouts.
And is that just the pipeline or the whole support structure that actually is fairly old now that supports it?
At the moment, there's 2 pipelines. So while we haven't done the optioneering work, because it's 10 years away, there's potential to do anything from replace 2 pipelines on completely separate alignments away from that gorge, or to replace the 2 pipelines as one. But we'll work through that in due course. But there's certainly options at the city's disposal.
Thank you very much. That's reassuring. Thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
Coming back to this item, so a national policy statement in the hierarchy of decision making in the RMA's structure sits above regional and district plans, right? And then regional and district plans are written to give effect to the national policy statement.
Correct.
So that's the context in which we are submitting this commentary today.
That is correct, yes.
Very good. Okay. And it will have implications then obviously in our long-term spending, depending on where this policy statement ends up. Because it will ultimately set the environment to which the regional plan then will be set later, especially affecting urban freshwater quality.
Yes, that's correct.
Good, thanks.
Councillor Walker.
Thanks, Tom and Simon. I'll shift direction slightly. Wetlands are, of course, a vital part of our ecosystem and, of course, the world's ecosystem. So on page 73, part 33, I'll let you guys get there. It mentions that the DCC supports initiatives to map the locations of other wetlands to facilitate better, I think there's a typo there, it should be understanding of how DCC activities may affect them, but consider mapping may take regional councils considerable time. Have you any sense of what considerable time means? Sorry, that's fairly
greater than a few years, I think.
Feel free to say no.
Yeah, look, broadly, I don't. We acknowledge that it's not likely to be a quick job. I think we don't have a timeline estimate on it because we haven't really considered what the mechanics of all of that might mean, but we know it would be a big job.
Councillor Hall.
With retention ponds on subdivisions and state highways, is there any monitoring going on to see how much contamination's coming out of those retention ponds with the plantings and stuff?
It's not something we're actively doing at the moment on a kind of a programmed basis, but is something we'll be potentially looking at soon. So we have a number of active detention ponds through various subdivisions, especially in Mosgiel now, with the ability to be able to, so we have the ability now to go and test those things. They've been in service for a period of time, and if there is contaminant build-up, is likely to be something that's a change that's detectable. But we haven't been undertaking any of that testing in detention areas that I'm aware of until now.
Well, you know, we've got the chance to do it, so the sooner we start doing it, it gives us some records to actually see if they are working like they're meant to be.
Yeah, I do agree.
Conscious that this is rapidly devolving into a fairly broad conversation about the entirety of the water network, which is helpful. You know, it's a broad and complicated issue, the implications of the paper being discussed. But I would urge councillors to focus on the report at hand. Councillor Lord.
Right, I'm scared to ask my question.
It's whittling down the list. Councillor Lorfiso.
Tēnā koe, Your Worship. Tēnā korua, Mrs. Drew and Mr. Dwyer. My question is around the summary of considerations on page 60 of the order paper, and it's the Māori impact statement. And I perfectly understand why, given the constraints of time and workload, that you haven't engaged directly with Kaitahu. And it's clear in the discussion document and etc. that ngā runanga, that's the runanga all over the motu, want to have a seat at the table given at the time of drafting policy. So my question is probably for Your Worship or Dr. Bidrose. In terms of the drafting or the negotiations of arrangements of mana whakahono ārohe with Kaitahu, where do we see in the future Kaitahu will be negotiated with directly on these things?
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
If I can just follow up on that, is that the kind of work, Dr. Bidrose, that will be resourced through Okaha via our current funding arrangement with them, or separately?
So we're just working through that proposal with Okaha at the moment. The anticipation is that the funding we put in is primarily around the kind of Kaitahu's governance role, and will pay for those kind of activities. Project-specific work will be paid for out of projects, and this is likely to fall more in that, but the line is, well, we will continue working through that over the course of the triennium.
Councillor O'Malley.
I just want to follow up Councillor Fiso's observation, because in the previous item, the Maori impact study says that Okaha has talked to the ORC, but then we didn't bother. So I'm just wondering, do you think in the future when we do these impact statements, it could be that mana whenua have confirmed that there is no impact? In other words, we've consulted and got feedback to the fact that we've got basically a statement of, yeah, and we don't care, or otherwise we have confirmed, because here it is, there are no known impacts, but we haven't actually got affirmation that that is in fact the case.
Thank you. It's a question for...
Well, it's kind of a question.
Staff, around process, really.
Yeah, I think we will get better at that once we have, certainly once we have our staff, our kaiwhakamaherehire on board, and once we have that agreement in place, but you're absolutely right.
The questions. I understand Councillor Wiley has circulated an amendment to this paper. Are you intending to move it as an amendment, or are you intending to move the submission as you're suggesting it be amended?
Your Worship, I'd be just looking to seek an amendment to the submission.
Move it as an amendment, that's fine.
I'll move the submission.
Councillor Wiley is moving an amendment for debate. Do you have a second?
Anyone move the...
No. Okay. Is there a seconder? Seconder, Councillor Lofisaw. Do you have a seconder for your amendment? Wait, we'll bring it up. It's been emailed around.
And I notice there is a slight grammar mistake.
Just to identify these yourself.
Yep. The DCC seeks commitment from the government that it is going to support funding projects that will produce the upgrades that essential freshwater proposals may have on local authorities.
You got a Councillor Houlihan. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor Wiley?
Actually, I think it pretty much sums up what part of the questions, and that the fact that I think we have to clearly articulate to the government that it's one thing to go down a pathway, but at some point somebody's got to pay for it, and they could have the greatest legislation in the world that is going to cost our ratepayers a very large sum of money. And I would like to see government actually come to the table in partnership or some other form and funding to ensure that their decision making actually is able to be carried out.
Thank you. Further speakers to the amendment? Councillor Houlihan.
I agree, and I also think in the previous report too, it was very clear that ORC has issues with, for example, staffing. We could potentially have that issue in the future as well. So I think, along with the funding and the need for, more experienced staff, I think we do need to talk to the government about that. And I agree, and I think it'll help collaboratively as well around all territorial authorities to help in those areas. So I think it's a good motion.
Further speakers? Councillor Reddick.
Yes, I agree also that in line with all of these amendments that we're putting, or the proposal we're putting forward, that we ask for funding proposals to go with.
Councillor Gary.
So,
sorry, did you finish?
Mine's a more generic comment, which is to acknowledge that during this very busy period, staff have been working away on these very complex submissions, 3 of them, and I just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that work.
Thank you. No further speakers to the amendment. This is what we are voting on now. I'll put the amendment. All those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? That's agreed. Councillor Benson-Pope, would you like to speak to the substantive paper? Other speakers? Councillor O'Malley?
I think this particular the submission that we're putting up, I think is very relevant because the freshwater policy statements as it's coming forward will have a lot of impact on us. I think people touched on the fact that it's going to have a significant economic impact on the city, especially if we're considering some of the more sensitive waterways like the Leith and Kaikorai Stream, which are actually in the 6A, but they will be, given that they're already in an ORC plan, they'll definitely be coming back through under this new headline. I also, though, am confident that we are way ahead of many other territorial authorities in the Otago region. I know that having attended one of these conferences, Clyde is still on septic, doesn't even have a reticulated sewer system. So we're quite a way ahead of some other municipalities in the area. However, obviously, anything that comes out of this national policy statement is going to have a significant impact on us. I would like us, and I think many have touched on it already, that it becomes part of our planning process as we do renewals to be anticipating what our needs will be in the future and make sure they show up in those works programs so that we're not hit with a massive bill at some point because we've been putting things off. Thank you.
Right of reply?
Yes, briefly, Your Worship, thank you. I think no one should be surprised that this issue is on the table. And for some decades, people have been talking in this community and wider in New Zealand of the need to change our approach to the discharge of stormwater in particular into our waterways. Those of us who occasionally or some more frequently drive the Peninsula Road and look at the current work that's being undertaken will be under no illusion about how many point discharges there are. And those of us who live near the Andersons Bay Inlet and some years ago swam in it with Daniel Loader, I hasten to add, and we won the race, will also not be surprised at the poor quality of the sediments in the upper harbour, where we pour most of our urban stormwater still completely untreated or unmitigated into the harbour. So there will be implications of this. We are going to have to face up to them. We would all hope, of course, that there will be support of various kinds for lifting our act about this. I don't doubt that we are much better performers than many other territorial authorities, but we have significant issues about contaminants, particularly from the road, running untreated or unmanaged into our waterways, and it's time we've got our act together. And so much and all as it may be expensive, I think we should be grateful for the government to making us lift our game in this respect.
Thank you. I'll put it. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Those against? That's agreed. Item 8, submission on resource management amendment bill, Ms Graham and or Ms Pinfold and Mr Worthington. Asked of thousands. The opening remarks you wish to make?
This
submission responds to some relatively straightforward amendments to the RMA, which are designed to reduce the complexity of the Act and to reinstate opportunities for public participation. So the submission's relatively positive or neutral on some points. But the submission also flags up in the conclusion some wider issues that we'd like taken into consideration in the wider review of the RMA. And in that light, there's an additional point which His Worship has brought to our attention and suggested be included, which hopefully will go up on the screen in a moment. So it reiterates a point raised in an earlier submission and asks government to reconsider the ability to strike out a submission for a layperson, which sounds complicated, but really it's just suggesting that they reconsider that point and that it compromises the ability of local people to participate in planning issues. So you might want to consider that as well.
If I might, for those present who haven't invested years of their life in the Resource Management Act, amendments made in 2017 allow commissioners or decision makers hearing consents to not consider submissions made by lay submitters, i.e. only consider expert witnesses with all the attendant training and expense that comes with bringing expert witnesses to an RMA hearing. So all this does is ask for that to be reconsidered, the clause 41D, section 41D that deals with that part of public participation. Questions? Moved, Councillor Benson, with the amendment.
The amendment.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second, Councillor. And doing so, thank you for your eagle eye and spotting the need for this to be clarified. Appreciate it.
Further speakers? I'll put it. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Those against? That's agreed. Thank you. And item 9 was the one added via the confirmation of the agenda acknowledgement of Provincial Growth Fund projects, I've called it. Councillor Benson-Pope.
I have forwarded suggested wording to the Secretary.
Moved, Councillor Benson-Pope. Seconded, Councillor Houlihan. Moved, Councillor Walker. Seconded, Councillor Houlihan. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor Walker? Other speakers? Councillor Houlihan.
I just want to say how amazing it is for our city. What happened today is so much money coming into our economy. I'm particularly excited about Code and the Digital Centre for Excellence. And I think what can come of that is so many exciting things. It's wonderful. So, sorry if I got that name wrong of Code.
Councillor Van der Vis.
I'd like to echo Councillor Houlihan's thoughts. Getting that many millions injected into some of our projects is certainly going to be very welcome, and I'm sure the city will get a lift as a result. But there's a however, and the however was forcibly brought home to me when I took my son for a boating ride from the Leith outlet, basically, right round along Friart Street, around the Harbour Basin to Kitchener Street, and looked at not just the Harbour Basin rotting wharves, but the kilometres of rotting wharves all the way along that, if you look at the photographs, and I'll send them later, show that there's been no maintenance there for at least 5 decades, and that we have an enormous deferred maintenance issue, not just in the Harbour Basin, but in all the wharves around the city, and that the failure of the ORC to do any maintenance there for a very long time is something which is going to make a lot of those wharves completely unusable in the near future, I believe, as opposed to just moderately awkward currently. So the amount that we got from the Provincial Growth Fund for dealing with the rotting wharves issue, $100 million for that alone, I think would have been very easily spent in the harbour basin, and that wouldn't have dealt with all the wharf issues that go all the way along the full length of Riot Street, another kilometre or so. So whereas we've got to be very grateful for what we have got, what we don't have is a solution to the really big deferred maintenance problem of our wharfage, and $20 million is not going to go near to making a big difference there. Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just want to reiterate the thanks to colleagues around this table who've worked considerably around this these particular bids, and particularly to acknowledge staff, and I was delighted to hear that acknowledged, both Ms Pinfold and the staff of Enterprise Dunedin and Fraser Liggett and the rest of the team in particular, and John Christie for his leadership. This has been significant work on top of their normal full-time work. And I think it's really important that we emphasise that. I'm delighted to see the acknowledgement of our jewel in the crown of our city, Otago Harbour. And yes, the wider harbour will benefit from this. It's not as much as we would have liked, but it is a start, and it behooves all of us to look upon it as a positive beginning. The Minister was very clear about the possibility of coming back for more. For those of us in attendance at the event, that was very clearly articulated. And I know there'll be many people in our community who will see this as the beginning of a focus on our amazing harbour and the wider harbour edge. So thank you to all those staff, to those colleagues who worked so hard for a wonderful outcome for our city today. It has been a good day at the office today.
Further speakers, Councillor Raddick.
Yes, just a couple of comments. Firstly, on Councillor Vandeviss's concept of the rotting wharves. I know a few people that are involved in repairs and maintenance on the wharves around the harbour, and I think there's a big difference between repair and maintaining a wharf to tie a ship against versus bringing a wharf up to the standard to build a building, a large building on top of. And so I think the money that we've got from the Regional Development Fund is for the purpose of building up the wharf to be able to construct a building on top, which is quite a different to what's normally needed just to tie up a ship. And I think the Harbour Board does a lot of maintenance, retaining, keep those wharves in workable condition, those wharves that it uses for its large ships. And the harbour basin is not being used for much at all, and only smaller boats. And further to that, along the same lines, but on a different topic, is the hillside workshops. I'm really pleased to see the money coming for the hillside workshops, because that could could make a big difference to the engineering hub in the city and the ability to do major heavy work in town, which used to be done in the distant past, but hasn't been over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Councillor Elder.
I just want to say how successful our mayor is in 2 weeks, 1.5 weeks, getting $60 million. Keep up the good work, Aaron. It's very successful. Now, I was just wanting to follow up. I suppose I stood for council because I wanted to see a diversification of Dunedin's economy, and I'm really, really grateful to the support that Claire Curran and other Labour MPs for promoting hillside workshops to be upgraded and take on the engineering work related to upgrading wagons, and also for the engineering hub and for the work being done and the money being invested in developing our manufacturing and production capacity in Dunedin, because we've got many, many skilled people in this area, and at the moment there's a lot of work and exciting things happening in this space. So this will enable a diverse economy with using the trades and the skills available that are in Dunedin, and I just think it's a great move. So yeah, thank you to those who supported that.
Thank you. Councillor Staines.
Thank you, Worship. I think while we're thanking people, we should be noting the input that our Mayor Dave Cull, our past Mayor Dave Cull, put to this project. He led that from the front, and I know that he kept very regular pressure on the government to get a resolution to the issue of whether there was funding available. So I think we should recognise that as well.
Councillor Wiley.
I think there are many positives that have come out of today, but it is going to be interesting to see what happens next around what government continues to fund, and that is a bit of a concern for me. But on the other side, it is really great to see the hillside workshops will come alive. And I think the other part is it also shows the rest of the engineering cluster and what is able to be done. And actually there are some world-class developments taking place there. Then we move into code and we look at the developments there. The part that really excited me when I look at hillside, the engineering workshops and code is there's a really strong pathway for the youth in our city, current and future, in getting employment and being able to live here. And that is something that really did make me excited about what was presented. The harbour side is a long-term project, a long-term vision, and we need to maintain the pressure on the government to say thanks for stage one, but there's going to be several stages to come for their partnership on this. Thank you.
Further speakers? Councillor Houlihan.
I'm getting very enthusiastic this meeting. But I just wanted to also say I think it's fantastic the money that went to startups, you know, and small businesses like Petri Dish, for example, that I think they got about 250,000, was that right, I think? And also the company they talked about that had was it the sewing machines or something he talked about? They got 900 and something thousand, yeah. And I just think it's incredible. Some of those businesses I'd never heard of, but what an amazing opportunity to start, you know, our economy moving with that injection of funds. Fabulous.
Thank you. For my part, I would, for me, the announcement around Hillside Workshop is the single most exciting thing that has come out of today. And I would like to add my thanks to Claire Curran, the local MP in Dunedin South, who has been indefatigable in her advocacy around Hillside Workshop, which has been creeping along effectively moribund since at least 2012. And many people, myself included, wrote off Ms Curran's advocacy as flogging a dead horse, and I'm not too proud to admit that I was wrong. And thank her for maintaining that pressure internally when the opportunity came along to be in government and be in a position to do something about it. They're talking about 40 permanent jobs reaching at least 100 over the next 10 years. And what excites me most about that is that the commitment has been made that 10% of their new workforce will come in the form of new apprentices. And I think that's incredibly important in terms of maintaining the future capacity of our engineering workforce in the city. And there's a beautiful poetry, I think, in the two announcements celebrating our vast industrial heritage at Hillside Workshop, and obviously the future of our burgeoning video game development industry through the Centre of Digital Excellence, the kind of low-weight, high-value export industries that we need to be encouraging if we do meet our environmental ambitions. But it's a great day for rail. As Ms Curran said in her remarks, today. It was written off as a sunset industry, but obviously, the future of moving not just freight but people around this country has to include further development of our rail network, and it's great that the capacity for servicing that will continue to be based on Hillside Road at Dunedin's iconic Hillside Workshop. Councillor Walker, your right of reply. I'll put it. All those in favour?
Division, please.
Taken by division. Thank you.
Councillor Barker.
Aye.
Councillor Benson Pope. Aye. Councillor Elder. Yay. Councillor Hall. Aye. Councillor Houlihan. Aye. Councillor Lefiso. Aye. Councillor Lord. Aye. Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Raddick.
Aye.
Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis.
Yes.
Councillor Walker.
Aye.
Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Sorry, Councillor Gary. No.
Aye.
Thanks. Your Worship.
Aye, it's carried unanimously. And that brings us to the end of the meeting on that positive note. Thank you all for your efforts.